Let's look at some real-time case studies of how artists work both spontaneously and also in a more intentional way. And I'm using examples that are fabric examples, but this would be true. The method of working would be true whether it was paper or canvas or collage or any other art form. It's the difference between responding, as I said, to the materials versus making a more intentional plan and then carrying that plan through to completion. Um, Most of us fall out on a continuum where perhaps we do a little bit of both. I would never, although I do like the planned approach as a way of getting started, I would never want to discount the serendipitous thing that can occur that might actually lend the spark or the real life to the piece at the end. And most people who work spontaneously have skills of some sort that they've honed, unless they're really beginning, and then the playtime is actually, I think, acquiring those skills. In any event, we'll see where this leads through these case studies that I'm sharing. We're starting with one that began as part of the Art Cloth Challenge. And the Art Cloth Challenge was basically this. 12 people agreed to participate. Each of them got a 2-yard length of fabric that looked like this picture on the screen. And they didn't know what they were getting, and there were only 2 rules. They needed to return it to me, and in addition to returning it to me, it needed to be intact as a whole piece of cloth when they returned it to me. And the idea was to look at how we all can start with something that's very similar and the very many directions that that can take. So our first example is Catherine Sylvan. Catherine applied glue to the surface. She drew the sort of plant spirally forms onto the fabric, and you can see, let's go back, notice that there are 4 white rings on the fabric that were created by tying it off before it was dyed. You see that ring in the center of this picture, and she's already done some printing over that ring. After she did that printing, then she drew onto the fabric with Elmer's glue, which can be used as a resist, and she discharged the fabric in a discharge bath, which means for the color to be removed. And when she took it out of the discharge bath, this is what the fabric looked like. So it no longer had that blue color that was the initial dye bath. Then Catherine coated the piece of fabric in a paste made from flour and water and rolled this commercial roller over it in order to work that design into the flour paste. And then the flour paste is allowed to dry. And so what you see here is actually the dried flour paste on that piece of fabric. Now, if we were working on canvas, we might have different approaches, but the way of layering impasto onto the surface and then sanding it off or gouging back into it would be very similar to what Catherine was doing on this fabric. After she let that flour paste dry, she applied some dye over it, and so now we're a couple of steps further along, and she has added dye and she's added some additional patterning, and you'll notice that those rings and that sort of spirally elongated design now runs down through the section of this yellow. So she's responding to the materials, but she definitely seems to have a game plan. And yet there's no real theme. The theme, if anything, is the circles and the spirals. At this point, she's added another layer of color by brushing it on selectively. And then she takes advantage of a process that she knows inside out because she's a master at this, whereby she has created another layer of discharge, and it's a layer of discharge that has introduced color simultaneously. And that is where these vivid purple and red shapes that have an outline of white have come from that very specialized process that she knows how to use. And so in the essay, I refer to the fact that I think sometimes when people are working spontaneously, it looks spontaneous to us because they're so loose with the imagery, or perhaps they're loose in the way the processes are put together, but there's a foundation there that really serves them well as it's serving her in this particular instance. She put down another layer of that discharge with the dye, and this time she got this very tiny, very shiny looking, although in fact I think it's the reflection of the light. It's not literally metallic, but the sort of tiny print image that she's got there in both the red and the purple did come from using that combination of discharge and dye process one more time. And you can see and I know this because Catherine has worked with me, that she's paying close attention to both contrast and relationship, and now she's added this small element to the surface of the fabric in that overall sort of tiny little seedy pattern that contrasts quite nicely with the middle-sized rings that are on the surface in the blue, and then the larger rings that are also in the blue in a variety of shapes. So she's building relationship and generating contrast through size, through scale, and also through color as she moves through the creation of the piece. This is an example of, or this is what the piece looks like when it's finished. It's hanging with some additional fabrics, and so the blue that you see on either side is actually two of the other projects that were included. You see what a vibrant, beautiful surface she has created, and most of it was very spontaneously achieved, but on the other hand took a certain amount of very deliberate work. It took effort. Another shot of it took a certain sense of knowledge to know how the processes would combine in order to create the final effect. So this is a great example of spontaneity and responding to the materials and responding to what happens and responding to the colors while still exerting some control over the process in order to be able to predict, at least at some point or on some level, what the end result will be. Now we're back to that fabric again, and this time we're taking a look at what Candy Edgerly did with the project. So she had the same piece of fabric, and Candy chose to fold the fabric up and then clamp it. It's clamped between two heavy pieces of, sometimes we use plexiglass, but it looks as though she's using some sort of a press board. And Candy chose to discharge the fabric also, but she went about it a little bit differently. And I know from having spoken with both these artists that they were just playing at this point. They thought, well, let me just do this, let me just do this discharging, and we'll see what happens, and then I'll respond to what has happened before I make my next decision. And that's where the spontaneity enters into the process for her. So she steams the fabric and discharges out some of the color, and this is the effect she gets. So the white rings are still there, the fabric is no longer blue, and the fabric did discharge into kind of a grid pattern that is that paler pink color compared to the gray where the blue used to be. And let's talk about that a minute. From the standpoint of contrast and relationship, now she's setting up, she's got a wonderful crackle in the background which existed from the first dye bath. She has the rings, and now she's creating some contrast in terms of shape by introducing this grid. That's her workstation, and she's been mixing up some dye, and she's adding it to this thickened print paste so that she can treat the dye like you might use a paint. And looks to me as though she's planning to move forward with this theme of using the rings, and that is probably driven as a response to the ring that was in the original dyed fabric. And so she's gotten out here a set of odds and ends that she probably had on hand, and let's see what she'll do with them next. She's put them down on that newspaper, and then she's laid her silkscreen on top, and she's poured dye into the silkscreen and pulled dye across the surface of the screen. And because those objects underneath are textured, you can see that you can see the shapes through the screen, and that will eventually become a pattern that she can print. Here you see a series of these screens, all of which are following through with this circular theme, and these are all thickened dye on the screen, and she's waiting for them to dry before she proceeds with printing. So once again, the process of putting those objects underneath the screen and screening dye across the surface creates a kind of unpredictable, spontaneous approach to the printing or to the imagery, and yet this is a time-consuming process, and she has to know what she's doing in order for it to work. Now she has actually started her printing, and so she's put down a layer of those round objects with dye, and that would have come from the screens that we saw drying. And she's rolling this up, and she's going to steam that in her steamer again, which is how she will set the dye. You can see she's added more than one color, and that grid in the background it's still there, but it's not nearly as obvious, and she's done a wonderful job of playing the circular images against the grid in the background. And there's the finished fabric. So it's a kind of a serendipitous freeform fabric once it's completed, and that's great. She added some gold leaf to it. You can see the sheen on the surface of the fabric. So we have here a piece that evolved in a fairly spontaneous response to each of the steps sort of way, and the end result is also sort of on the loose side. We actually refer to this as breakdown printing is one name it gets. But the end result is rather unpredictable, and that's one of the things that artists love about it. And what that means is that as you're pushing the process and working with it, you're responding to it, and if the layer that you've just put down doesn't look finished to your eye, then you're thinking already ahead to what might come next. And so there's an order and a back and forth sort of play between spontaneity and planning, even within this kind of approach to this rather loose and beautiful surface. Now, these are some examples from Kathy Williams, and this is a series, and the series is seasonal, and so this is the first piece in the series, and this is spring. And you can see that she had, one of the hallmarks of Kathy's work is that she incorporates photographs into these collaged fabric surfaces, and so there is literally, as the focal point, there is a photograph that represents, I think, a bird of paradise. And so she has layered that with organza and the printing, the springtime printing of the flowers, and she worked with the symbology of the color in advance. So this is the spring piece. And note those tiny little circles that she's using as the texture in the background. That's an example of part of her visual language, which is distinctive to Kathy. She created that image, and that's an image that will show up time and time again in the work that she does. This is summertime, so some of the imagery is different, but her approach to the materials and the use of some of that tiny design information in the background, that's the crowd scene. The crowd scene repeats across several of the pieces in the series. And once again, the focal point is the rectangle, which is actually a photograph related to the other parts of the composition. This is fall, and the fall leaves that are represented in the photograph move on out to the fabric surface in a way that is almost so subtle that in this photograph we can't see it, although we can see some of the leaves, and we can see the use of that background texture again to keep the piece interesting. And this is winter, and so in this case the photograph is the bare tree in the center. That's the focal point. And then we have the beautiful sort of shading and soft color and the snowflakes added onto the surface with that texture, but the texture is so faint that really in this particular photograph you can't see it. And yet you see how the elements work together in different colors and values in order to support the seasonal theme of each of the pieces. This is work by Mary LeBlanc, and this is very detailed, pretty amazing work. Mary was inspired by moving to New Mexico and studying the native peoples who were indigenous to that part of the United States. She was inspired by their approach to the seasons and by the symbols that they used. And so she worked with these 4 pieces based on that symbolism. And the pieces are very elaborate. They all started as folded and dyed fabrics that were dyed more than one time. They all have, as you'll see in the close-ups in a minute, incredible detail printed into the background to make the texture even more pronounced than it already is. And then she worked with each of the panels to develop on the left the fall leaves, in the center the stalactites and stalagmites of some of the cave dwellings. On the third panel from the left, you see the eagle descending, of course, a very important symbol to Native Americans, or totem. And let me point out right now, at the bottom of that panel, you can see the silhouettes of people looking. These represent people looking up to the totem, the important figure that the eagle is. On the right, I hope you can see that shadow of the bull in the bottom half of that particular piece, and again this triangle which has been inverted in this particular instance. Very deftly handled use of the combination of imagery in panels that are approximately 3 feet by 6.5 or 7 feet. The objects are a combination of being cut and fused onto the panels, so in a sense these are collage. And these are examples of the scavenger hunt that's involved in planning for a series like this. This series didn't just happen. This took an incredible amount of planning and decisions about what the imagery should be, how it could hang together visually as the set, what objects would be specific to the pieces, as is true of the vase and the second one from the left, the silhouettes in the third panel, and what elements would remain, would tie the series together, which is what's true of the use of the specific elements to this particular people, and also to the use of the triangle across the series, and as a matter of fact, related to the use of the tiny imagery in the background, the non-specific textural stuff, plus the very careful flag folding that created the dyed texture, which was the very first step in the process. So she went looking on this scavenger hunt for words and for elements that would be appropriate to each of the panels and also appropriate to the entire feeling of the series. And you can see there on the left some of that non-specific texture that she created in two of the silhouettes. And she struggled with the silhouettes, and I can report that the way she finally determined how to find them and where to get them was to literally take black and white photographs of people who were her classmates in this pose of looking upward. And then she translated those black and white photographs into these silhouettes, which were cut from organza and fused to the surface of the pieces. On the right, you can see the screen printing that was involved in making those very wonderfully stylized leaves, which fit perfectly with the sharp angularity of the dye work in the background. Very sophisticated. All of the parts support the theme. Each of the parts moves each of the pieces forward to a really significant conclusion for her with this particular series. We'll close with some examples of a series of my own. I've used my boundary series so often that I decided it was time to pull out another set of examples, and so I'm sharing with you now how I myself work a lot of the time in order to lay the groundwork for the series that may then have very spontaneous things happening as I go along. I decided that I've been working with archetypes, Carolyn Myss's archetypes, for a relatively long time, 6 or 7 years before I worked up the courage to, or felt actually seated enough in the material that I was ready to pursue it as a series. It went for some period of time, and then I laid it aside for a while. I'm actually thinking that I want to move back into this body of work and go at it another time, which is an interesting thing to consider. But for me, one of the first things to do was to look at old notebooks, and you can see actually a spiral-bound notebook from 1973, when one of my interests as a young person was to go around Ohio, where I grew up, and collect mushrooms and do these spore prints and keep track of the mushrooms that I found and the various qualities that they had. And I thought of myself as sort of a junior naturalist, I think, and was very taken by the beauty of the flora, the fauna, and especially how different mushrooms are from each other. So I dug out this notebook and was inspired by some of that imagery and thought about how that would fit into the whole idea of archetypes. Didn't really know, but that was one of the first places I started. Then I did my free association. Well, on the right, you see that I chose my 12 archetypes, and I had my list of where those were within a particular system, which we don't need to go into detail about here, but I had each of those selected, and then I set out to free associate to each of those archetypes: the rebel, the guide, the damsel, the child, the mother, the artist. So I did the free association, and you see there on the bottom picture an example of my typing out the free association so I could read my own handwriting, to tell you the truth, and some of the handwriting that I did. This is taken directly from my journal. So I worked with each of the archetypes doing the free association, and then also doing some basic journal sort of writing about what it meant to me and what my memories from childhood were. And then I started thinking about the colors and the symbolism of that. Symbolism, what color each archetype might be in my mind. So it's a very rich place to exist. And I think once you go there and you understand the richness of the experience related to your own development as an artist, you begin to understand why it's worth taking the time to pursue it in this way. So I started looking for elements because of some of that free association, as I said in the essay, one of the next steps after the free association is to look for, within that list, images that are already visual. And so for me, the kingfisher was already a visual. The kingfisher represents the judge to me. Fair, actually, when you look up kingfisher, which is another place you can take this, he is literally a symbol within the animal world of wisdom. And so I appropriated that image based on both my feeling of attraction to that particular bird and also to what he stands for symbolically within the cultures. Was also really drawn to the hummingbird and its fleeting, flitty sort of joie de vivre approach to life, and this seemed somehow as though it might work with the child archetype that I chose, which was the magical child, and we each have one, the child who loves the natural world, loves playfulness, loves everything childlike. So these were some of the images that I began to work with. I was also doing my writing, and in not only in my journal, but also a mantra that I use as my prayer on a regular basis. And so this actually turned into a fairly evolved series, and this is a close-up of the piece that was my child. And so I've actually taken that hummingbird image and greatly simplified it and machine embroidered it onto this playful, delightful, colorful background, upon which is the mantra that I wrote by hand on every single one of the pieces within this series. And so the mantra becomes one of the design elements. From a distance you can't see it. The writing isn't particularly neat, so sometimes you can't read it. So it becomes a textural element that ties all of the pieces in the archetype series together, despite the differences in the specific archetypes and the topics themselves. There are two more close-ups from that piece. The flower paste, which is the black and white patterning that you see at the bottom, is once again that process that Catherine Sylvan used in her piece at the beginning of this lecture. The basic process goes like this, if you're not familiar with it. You coat fabric with a mixture of flour and water that's the consistency of pancake batter. And that's nice and thick, and then you let that dry. You can write into it, and so you see that word magical was actually written directly into the wet flour paste. When the flour paste dries, it scrunches up a little bit like mud cracking in the sun, and then you can brush India ink or black paint over it. It seeps down through the flour paste and creates this pattern on the fabric. And once that flour paste has been washed away, this little snippet is an example of what you get. And so this flour paste was another process that tied my archetype pieces together because I used it on every single piece. And here's an example. You see the flour paste with that writing on the right, and you see on the left, hard to discern in this photograph, but that's a piece that's been manipulated and dyed, and it has maps printed on it. And the piece in the middle is a piece that was folded and dyed numerous times. And this is my guide piece from that archetype series. And so the flag fold was used frequently. That's the folding pattern that created that blue pattern up through the center of the piece. That was a way of manipulating the fabric that I used in each of the pieces in the archetype series. Then each piece had its own individual elements, and in this case, those white rings were, in my mind, smoke rings, because when I free associated to what the guide does, one of the images that came to me is the Native American guide who rides out across the prairie and looks for places for the entire tribe to move to, and then sends up the smoke signals so that people know where to go. And so this piece combines the map imagery, the smoke rings, and the textured flour paste with the mantra written into it into one piece that's actually quite a bit more abstract than the piece that had the hummingbird on it. And so I'm including this as a way of showing that within one series, pieces can range from being very figurative, or maybe not so figurative, to being much less representational, to the point of being more abstract as this piece is. If I hadn't explained it to you, you might not get the significance. but I think it hangs together visually because of the color and the design, the scale and the use of the elements in a way that makes it cohesive whether or not you understand the story behind it. The mother was another one of my archetypes, and so you see the flag fold pattern and the flower paste crackle in the background here, and then the very simple partial female form drawn with needle felting through the surface of the quilt. And in this case, a specific line of red cross stitch that binds two panels together up the left, the left third of the panel vertically. One of those subtle comments on how women sew together or piece together, patch together the various aspects that are required in order to be effective as a mother. This was another piece that was related to being the guide, a different, sometimes I did more than one piece experimenting with the basic ideas. And so you see the smoke rings there again, and you see the text in the flower paste there again. What you see on the left is a different approach to the flag folding, and it's using colors that are in the complementary range. So I've got the greens and the reds happening there together, and the push-pull of those colors represented to me a little bit of what a guide does. The guide thinks about what everybody will benefit from and then has to think about what's good for them too. And so there's a push-pull that was, in my own mind, represented by the use of the complementary colors. And when I'm analyzing and working, I'm thinking about all these things in a rather playful way. And when someone sees the work, once again, they don't have to understand. You don't have to give away your whole story. I don't have to tell you what every single element means unless I'm in a class setting like this where it might benefit you. In general, what I really want is for someone to look at the piece and just find it intriguing or find it beautiful. And the last piece in the program right now was the piece that is my judge. You can see there that the Kingfisher image is retained intact. That is a paper lamination against the flower pasted silk fabric in the background. The mantra is written there again, scratched into paint, and in this case there is actually some raw fiber needle felted to the surface of the composition to the right to add literal texture to the surface. And the piece is cut down the middle from left to right with a green line of pearl cotton stitching. That's because judges have to be fair, don't they? And so the words that you see written into the flower paste are also words that were directly taken from the free associating that had to do with the judge. Balanced, fair, open, determined, open-minded, safe, generous. And so all of those components come together along in a, kind of an abstracted, loose way. And then the focal point is definitely this recognizable bird, which looks great on the line there. You don't have to know why the bird is there at all. And yet, if I discuss it with someone, I'll be eager to explain to them the significance of the kingfisher as a symbol of wisdom in a variety of cultures and why that led to my choice to include him in this piece of work. I think if you go online and Google around, and I guess I have to be non-specific, but if you start looking at artists of all kinds, I've concentrated on textile artists, but you can look at painters, you can look at painters in every genre. You can look at people who do embroidery, you can look at people who do woodworking or ceramics. And I encourage you to do that because I think what you'll find is that when you look at somebody's body of work, their interplay between the spontaneous and the more controlled planning will be evident because of what we've talked about here, if it wasn't already before. That's another way to expand. You know, we could go on for another hour with this, looking at other examples. But I think in a way it'll be more entertaining for you to do the research and find some examples on your own. And I really encourage you to spend a little time and do that prior to designing, or perhaps simultaneously to following through with the exercises that were the assignment this week of developing the ideas for a series of your own and beginning your own scavenger hunt.